In December 1900, on the remote Flannan Isles of Scotland, 3 lighthouse keepers mysteriously vanished. No bodies were ever found, no trace of them remained, only strange and haunting clues left behind. It is a tale that begins on the windswept cliffs of Eilean Moor, the largest of the Flannan Isles, a lonely speck of rock in the Outer Hebrides, battered endlessly by the violent waters of the Atlantic Ocean. For centuries, sailors dreaded these isles, calling them cursed, for many ships had wrecked upon their jagged teeth of stone, swallowed whole by the furious sea. In the late 19th century, the Northern Lighthouse Board, weary of the countless tragedies, constructed a lighthouse on the island to safeguard passing vessels. Rising 75 feet above the cliffs, its beacon was a promise of safety, a guardian light piercing through storms. But this light would soon become a symbol of darkness and dread, for within just a year of its operation, its keepers would vanish into nothingness, leaving behind one of the most chilling mysteries of the sea. The men who served here were no ordinary workers. They were solitary souls entrusted with lives of responsibility and isolation. Their names were Thomas Marshall, James Duckett, and Donald MacArthur. Duckett was the principal keeper, stern and experienced. Marshall, his second, was diligent but known to feel the strain of the sea. MacArthur, the occasional third keeper, was a man of strong temper but equally strong faith. Together, they kept the light burning, braving storms that lashed the cliffs and winds that screamed like the voices of the dead. Yet as the year 1900 drew to a close, something beyond mere storms awaited them. On December 26th, a relief vessel named the Hesperus arrived at the isle. Its captain expected to see the keepers waiting on the dock, ready to greet the incoming supplies, as was tradition. But the pier stood empty. The island seemed silent. No smoke rose from the chimneys. No movement stirred in the yard. Unease crept over the men as they rowed ashore. The door to the lighthouse was unlocked. Inside, 2 of the oilskin coats, the heavy gear worn against the storm, were missing, but one still hung in place. The clock on the wall had stopped. The beds were unmade, as if abandoned in haste. On the table lay a half-eaten meal, untouched, as though the men had risen mid-bite and never returned. In the logbook, the final entries painted a strange picture. Fierce storms had battered the island, though no storms had been recorded on the mainland at that time. Marshall had written of severe winds, the worst I have ever seen in 20 years, and noted that MacArthur, usually a hardened man, had broken into tears of fear. The entries grew more unsettling. References to prayers, silence, and then nothing. The last words were dated December 15th. Storm ended. Sea calm. God is over all. But when the Hesperus had sighted the lighthouse, its lamp had been dark for over a week. Where had the keepers gone? No sign of struggle was found, no blood, no footprints leading into the sea. Just silence and the endless roar of the waves. The relief crew fanned out across the island, hoping to find some clue, yet the search yielded little beyond unsettling fragments that deepened the riddle. Near the western landing, ropes lay scattered at the base of a supply crane, as though hastily abandoned. Iron railings were bent and twisted by tremendous force, and tufts of grass were torn from the earth, as if wrenched by invisible hands. But there were no bodies, no footprints in the mud, no drag marks across the rock. The sea, wild and relentless, crashed far below, and it was suggested that perhaps the men had been swept away while securing equipment in a storm. Yet this theory faltered. Why would all 3 men leave the safety of the lighthouse when regulations demanded one keeper must always remain inside? And why had one oilskin coat been left behind, suggesting at least one man had rushed out unprepared into the raging elements? Stranger still, on the mainland, no great storm had been reported during the days of their disappearance. While the logbook described monstrous winds and a howling sea that shook the very stone, observers elsewhere spoke only of calm waters. Was it possible the keepers had suffered a kind of shared hallucination? Or had something far more sinister enveloped the island in a storm unseen by the outside world? Rumors soon began to swirl. Some claimed that the men had been taken by the sea itself, devoured by waves that reached higher than the cliffs. Others whispered of ghostly lights seen above the island in the nights before their vanishing, strange spheres that danced and hovered, as though watching. Sailors muttered of sea serpents rising from the deep, their coils large enough to snatch a manhole. Locals spoke of curses, pointing to the island's ancient chapel dedicated to St. Flannan, a place long abandoned but feared, where travelers refused to linger after nightfall. They said the land was holy, yet cursed, an uneasy paradox with a natural and supernatural blurred. Perhaps the keepers had trespassed against something older than the lighthouse, and their punishment was to be taken, erased as though they had never lived. The Northern Lighthouse Board convened an inquiry, examining the evidence with cold precision. They concluded that a freak wave, a massive wall of water, might have swept the men away as they secured the crane on the western landing. Yet even as this explanation was written into the official record, doubts gnawed at those who knew the keepers best. Duckett was meticulous, never careless, and Marshall, though young, followed every rule. MacArthur, for all his temper, would never abandon his post without reason. And so the mystery endured, feeding upon itself with every telling, until the Flannan Isles were forever etched into maritime legend. To this day, visitors who climb the winding path to the lighthouse say they feel a heaviness in the air, as though the rocks themselves remember. Some hear voices carried on the wind, 3 men calling faintly through the storm, warning, pleading, lost forever in the endless roar of the Atlantic. And so the whispers of the Flannan Isles did not end with the official inquiry. Rather, they multiplied, growing stranger with each retelling, until the lighthouse became more than a beacon of safety. It became a symbol of dread. Fishermen refused to sail too close to the rocks, claiming they saw figures standing on the cliffs at night, waving silently, before vanishing into the dark. Some spoke of lights that glowed within the tower itself, though it had been empty since the men's disappearance, as if phantom keepers still carried out their duties. A century-old account from a passing ship told of hearing a bell toll from the island when no bell was there, a sound that echoed across the waves like a funeral knell. Skeptics dismissed these tales as the products of imagination, fueled by fear and isolation. Yet even skeptics avoided spending the night on the isle. Legends grew around the keepers themselves, that MacArthur had murdered the others in a fit of rage before taking his own life, that Duckett and Marshall had discovered something ancient buried beneath the rocks and were dragged to another realm, that all 3 had been seized by beings from the sky, whisked away in a blinding light that left only shadows etched into the stone. In the decades that followed, new lighthouse crews rotated in and out, but none stayed without unease. Diaries mentioned doors opening and closing on their own, boots shifting across the floor while men slept, and the sound of dripping water echoing from walls that were dry to the touch. More than one keeper quit his post early, swearing that he had heard voices calling his name from the cliffs, the same voices that had once belonged to Duckett, Marshall, and MacArthur. The Flannan Isles became a place where the boundary between the known and the unknown frayed, where the vast ocean seemed to breathe with secrets too heavy to tell. Even now, over 100 years later, when storms rage across the Atlantic and waves batter the rocks, sailors say they glimpse 3 shadowy figures pacing the lantern room, still bound to their duty, still waiting for relief that will never come. And the question remains, echoing endlessly in the roar of the sea, what truly happened on that lonely isle in December of 1900, when 3 men stepped out into the storm and were never seen again? And so the Flannan Isles held their secret, silent and indifferent as the decades passed. Even the most rational observers found themselves unsettled by the island's presence, a rock jutting out of the Atlantic like a sentinel of forgotten horrors. The lighthouse, once a symbol of human ingenuity, had become a monument to mystery. Visitors who climbed its spiral staircase reported a chilling sensation, as if invisible eyes tracked their every movement, and the wind carried whispers in a language older than any living memory. Some claimed to see 3 figures at the top, shadows that lingered behind the lantern's glass, moving as though still tending the light. Theories continued to evolve. Some said the keepers had encountered beings from the deep, creatures that dwell beneath the waves and claimed the living when provoked. Others suggested cosmic interference, that the men had stepped into a temporal anomaly, vanishing from our reality entirely. Writers and journalists, drawn by the story's magnetic pull, added layers of narrative, blending fact with fiction until the line between reality and legend blurred entirely. And still, the sea remains the same, indifferent, vast, and eternal, pounding against the rocks in ceaseless rhythm. Each wave seems to murmur the names of Thomas Marshall, James Duckett, and Donald MacArthur, a haunting litany carried on the wind. Their disappearance is a puzzle that mocks every attempt at explanation, a reminder of humanity's fragility when faced with forces beyond comprehension. Perhaps they were victims of a storm, perhaps of madness, perhaps of some ancient, unseen power tied to the isle itself. The truth is unreachable, hidden behind the roar of the Atlantic and the silence of Eilean Moor. And so, when night falls upon the Flannan Isles, when the lighthouse beam sweeps across the dark waters, it is more than a guide for sailors. It is a ghostly sentinel, a reminder that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, that some stories linger forever, unfinished, whispering of 3 men who vanished in December 1900 and left behind only absence, shadow, and the eternal question. What really happened on the Flannan Isles?